April 10, 1912. For RMS Titanic, it was her maiden voyage and her last. Just 4 days later, the ship everyone thought was unsinkable sailed at full speed into the perilous waters of the North Atlantic. An iceberg loomed up out of the dark, slicing a huge gash down her side. She took 2.5 hours to sink. In the icy waters, 1,503 people died. Less than half that number were saved. Why did so many drown? Was the captain to blame? Or was this, the world's most notorious maritime disaster, a tragedy predestined in time? The precise point in the North Atlantic where the Titanic went down has never been satisfactorily located. On board were said to be hoards of treasure, some of it too valuable to be recorded on the ship's manifest. Gold bullion to pay for First World War armaments. A jeweled copy of the Rubaiyat by Omar Khayyam. The personal belongings of no fewer than 57 millionaires who had chosen to sail on her. The upper decks of the Titanic, said a commentator, had a smell all of their own, a smell of perfume and of champagne and of wealth. 12,000 feet beneath the forbidding sea, she is a prize and a challenge that many men have dreamed of recovering. Yet her whereabouts remain unknown. In 1981, the Texas oil millionaire Jack Grimm went searching for her for the second year running. The search ship carried on board the most modern equipment that science could provide. Sonar detectors, underwater cameras capable of operating in spectacular detail at depths no previous expedition had ever ventured. For so large a vessel to vanish without trace is just one of the puzzles that have fascinated naval historians ever since her fated voyage. She was thought by the world at large to be unsinkable. The flagship of the White Star Line, she was the largest luxury liner ever built. She was the technological masterpiece of her time. Just as no expense was spared on her hull, her fittings were of surpassing luxury. First-class passengers could enjoy cabins with ornate carvings and plush furnishings. A lavish menu. Silk sheets adorned some beds. A maid's room adjoined each suite. Nothing was too good. Only a few pitiful human reminders were salvaged from the wreckage. The discharge book of the lookout seaman who spotted the fateful iceberg too late. The life vest that carried Mrs. John Jacob Astor, the wife of one of the millionaires, to safety. Her husband, like most men, chose to stay on board and die like a gentleman. A champagne cork from an early evening celebration. A deck chair washed into the icy waters and picked up by one of the rescue ships. The handkerchief of one of the survivors. A strangely unlucky sequence of events put the Titanic on course for disaster. The captain knew that there was ice in the area and steered 8 miles further south than planned in order to miss it. The lights on the foredeck were dimmed to give the lookouts a better view. The night was eerily calm.
Well, the first thing you usually see of an iceberg is the glint from the crystallized surface. And you see this long before you see the actual berg itself. You see a kind of glow. On this occasion, probably, the iceberg had just fallen over so that it wasn't showing a crystallized side. It was showing a side that had been under the water for a long time and was totally dark. So there was no swell, no sea, no ripples around the berg. Nothing to see at all. Just a dark shadow on the water.
Immediately, 3 warning bells were rung. The huge ship was steered hard to port in a desperate attempt to miss the berg. Lewis Gorman of the Titanic Historical Society explains what happened next.
A spur of the iceberg, and as most people know, an iceberg is more below the water than above. And the spur ripped the ship below the waterline, approximately from the bow to below number 1 funnel, opening up these compartments in this area. Now, the watertight compartments in the ship are vertical. And what happened is that the forward compartments were opened. As they filled with water, the law of physics took over here, and the weight distribution changed, and the ship began to tilt. Had the ship hit the berg head-on, she would not have sunk. She would have absorbed it in maybe the first 2 compartments, and she would have maintained her floatability. However, this did not happen, and the spur of the iceberg acted as a big razor blade opening up the compartments. As this happened, they did not realize, of course, the passengers, the extent of the damage. This was such a large and well-built ship that it felt just like a jar. Eyewitnesses' account tell us that many people didn't realize it. It was only as the ship began to settle, as things began to slide, as water in the glasses began to slant, that you realized that something was amiss.
One of the few survivors of the tragedy alive today was 7 years old at the time, traveling on the Titanic with her mother and father. Eva Hart has a vivid memory of that night.
The greatest tragedy about the Titanic is the fact that she hadn't enough lifeboats. If she'd had enough lifeboats, no one would have died. And so it was just a question of the people who were on deck first, people who were there in plenty of time, got a seat in a lifeboat. Their lives were saved. And because my mother was wide awake and fully dressed, we were up on deck right away. My mother said it was such a little bump that it reminded her of a train pulling up. You see, we were on the port side of the ship, and this tremendous gash was on the starboard side of the ship. And it certainly wasn't enough to wake me. My father went up on deck as she made him go, and he came back and said to her, "You'd better put on this very thick coat of mine, and I'll put on another one." Which he did. He put this thick coat on her, and he put another coat on himself. And he picked me up out of my bed and wrapped a blanket round me and carried me up onto the deck. And people were milling about up there. My father said to my mother, "Now stand here by this lifeboat, and whatever anyone may say to you, don't move." And we stood there, and gradually people came thronging onto the deck, and there seemed to be people rushing about, and to my recollection, a tremendous amount of noise. And he did come back and say, no, they weren't going to launch the boats. And then he went away again and came back and said, yes, they are going to launch the boats, but it's only a precaution. One of the officers told me, you'll probably be back on board for breakfast. And anyway, they launched the boats, and my father put my mother and I in. He helped other women and children. He made no attempt at all to get in himself. And we, fortunate people who were on deck in time, were saved. The others had 2.5 hours in which to wait to die, knowing that there was no means of saving them. Well, quite the most terrifying thing that I think, the thing that I can't even bear to think about now, is the sound of people drowning. When they finally were all in the water, the ship went under the water, all of which we saw, and I was wide awake. The terrible sound of people drowning, nothing could describe it. 1,503 people falling into icy water and screaming and drowning, and the noise of hissing steam. That was very prevalent. And one day when I was older, I was saying something about it to my mother, and I said, oh, that terrible noise. And she said to me, yes, and a terrible silence that followed it. And it hit me then, I realised that it did. It seemed as if everything in the world stood still after that moment.
Gradually, the full and terrible extent of the tragedy became known. While mourners grieved, newspapers started asking questions. Who was to blame? Why were there so few survivors? The hunt for a scapegoat began. The world was stunned by the tragedy of the Titanic, and ever since, writers have tried to piece together the causes of the disaster. At an inquiry headed by Lord Mersey, vital questions were asked, one by one.
I understand the Titanic was engaged in a race to beat the speed record across the Atlantic. Is this true?
She was not, as some people surmise, trying to break the speed record for the North Atlantic. She was not that fast.
The Titanic received at least 4 warnings of icebergs in the area. Why did she ignore them?
The fourth and most dramatic warning came about dinner time. This was of icebergs and growler ice right in the path that she was taking. Now, there's a lot of doubt whether this ever got to the bridge. At the time, the Titanic's radio officer was sending personal messages to the shore from the passengers, expecting to get ashore the following day, etc. And probably this message, this vital message, never got to the bridge.
Everyone thought the Titanic was unsinkable. Why then did she sink?
No marine architect would say such a ship is unsinkable. However, by the standards of design at the time, it was the best designed ship in terms of compartmentation and floatability.
Knowing there was ice in the area, why did Captain Smith not slow down or even stop like other liners in the area?
Quite simply because it was the custom of the White Star and most of the other crack transatlantic liners to get their passengers to the other side without stopping if they could avoid it. They did so because they knew that with a good lookout they could see icebergs, and unless the visibility was bad, they didn't stop. So the Titanic didn't stop, and it is only with hindsight that you might ask, why did she not stop or slow down?
How carefully did the crew look for icebergs? Can they be charged with carelessness or negligence?
In those days, there was no such thing as radar. The only procedure was extra lookouts. For example, in the forward lookout, 2 lookout men were set.
All precautions that could be taken, apart from stopping the ship, were in fact taken. The lights on the foredeck were dimmed so they wouldn't dazzle the lookouts. The lookouts were warned to look out for ice.
Every witness agrees that with enough lifeboats, every single person on the Titanic could have been saved. Why then were there so few lifeboats?
The Board of Trade, which governed the life-saving accommodation on British ships in those days, believed that if she had enough watertight compartments, they needn't have enough lifeboats, needn't have more lifeboats than a certain minimum number.
So, was no one to blame? With 1,503 people drowned, the inquiry had to come up with an explanation. The judgment was that a nearby ship, the Californian, had failed to come to the rescue quickly enough. Her captain, Stanley Lord, was censured. But ever since, there has been a fight to clear his name. Mystery still surrounds the part that the Californian played. Her radio operator, it is said, was asleep at the time. Her logbook shows she was stationary among the icebergs. Captain Lord was inexperienced in such conditions. But could she have seen the distress signals from the Titanic and failed to answer them? This was the crime for which Captain Lord was pronounced guilty. As the survivors bobbed about in their lifeboats waiting to be rescued, undoubtedly a ship of some sort approached.
I saw a ship, which seemed to me to be quite close by, close enough to see all her ports and the lights on her deck, and definitely not moving. And it seemed so close, and I can remember crying for a long time and saying, why doesn't that ship come to us? It wasn't big compared with the Titanic, because she was very big. But certainly it was a ship, and the outline of the ship and all the lights on it. Not just some lights on the horizon.
But was this ship the Californian? Peter Padfield, having examined the evidence from both the British and American inquiries into the disaster, thinks Captain Lord was made a scapegoat.
To my mind, the evidence is conclusive. It could not have been Captain Lord, because when the Titanic sank, none of the lookouts or the officers on the watch of the Titanic could see any ships in the vicinity. Subsequently, while they were getting the boats down, a ship did appear, came towards the Titanic until she was as close as 5 miles and you could see her side lights, and then she turned and went away again. The evidence is conclusive that the Californian was stopped during the whole night, and therefore that single fact, apart from many others, convinces me that it couldn't possibly have been the captain of the Californian.
The dispute is basically about the relative position of the two ships. According to the inquiry, the Californian was no more than 5 miles away and should easily have seen the distress signals. But in the confusion that followed the collision with the iceberg, did the Titanic signals officer make a mistake? He worked out a position by dead reckoning, based on a star sighting 6 hours before. He did not allow for drift. The currents in that part of the North Atlantic are powerful. Allowing for drift, it's possible that the Titanic and the Californian would have been separated by at least 20 miles, and the distress signals impossible to see. The matter could be settled once and for all if a search expedition could pinpoint the actual position of the Titanic. So far, this has not happened, as the chief scientist of the 1981 vessel admitted.
The one interesting thing is where the Titanic, this is where the Titanic hit the iceberg, okay? The current was drifting in this direction, and here is where they picked up the survivors hours later. You can see we have quite a few anomalies in that particular area. The scientists can't tell for sure if it's a man-made object or geological.
There is considerable doubt about whether the Titanic is still intact. Charles Haas of the Titanic Historical Society explains the possibilities.
Many survivors' accounts report that there was a loud, roaring, rumbling noise as if everything in the ship had broken loose and had crashed down to the bow. In fact, this was probably the ship's boilers. There were 29 of them, and each one weighed 90 tons, plus the ship's engines weighing hundreds of tons. And all of this tremendous weight plummeted down towards the bow, crashing and smashing its way through everything until it probably exited right through the bow of the ship. Once the ship achieved an equilibrium, it then settled back slightly and plunged downward underwater. Now, there are two theories as to what became of the ship. The first was that she continued in a nose-down position until she finally hit the bottom, striking somewhere at a speed of 30 to 50 miles an hour. The other theory said that the Titanic sank like a leaf, in that she moved back and forth through the water and suffered less damage when she finally hit the bottom.
It is on record that a number of passengers canceled their reservations, seemingly foreseeing disaster. It was an extraordinary coincidence that she should sink on her maiden voyage and that she should strike an iceberg below the waterline in the only way that made her vulnerable. Eva Hart's story of her mother's premonition of disaster is just one of many similar tales.
My father made up his mind to cut his losses here and to go to Canada. Well, he booked a first-class passage for us in the ship called the Philadelphia. Now, from the very moment that this had been decided, my mother had an extraordinary premonition, something she'd never had in her life before, never had again. Then came the day I heard my father say to her very crossly, and I wouldn't mind quite so much if you told me what it is you're so frightened of. And she said, I couldn't tell you, I don't know. But I know it's a fatal thing for us to do, we just mustn't go. And then came the news that we couldn't sail in the Philadelphia because there was a dock strike, and I really think my mother thought that was more or less a reprieve, but not my father. And one day, to his immense joy, we were told that if we paid some extra money, we could go second class in the Titanic, largest ship in the world. And then and only then did my mother say, well, now I know why I'm frightened. And he said, why are you frightened? And she said, because they say this ship is unsinkable, and that is flying in the face of God. They will never get there. And she was so right. And never again in her life did she have premonition. But to that premonition, I owe my life. Because my mother never went to bed in that ship. She slept in the daytime and sat up at night.
The story of the Titanic is one that raises more questions than it answers. Where exactly was she lost? Will we ever find out? What was the mystery ship that sailed so close to her in the night? A radio operator asleep. An ice warning that never reached the bridge. A collision that struck where the Titanic was most vulnerable. Could this set of circumstances be entirely accident? As a result of the Titanic tragedy, the United States Coast Guard runs an international ice patrol, and all transatlantic liners use a more southerly route. Perhaps it's a small consolation for the relatives of the 1,503 people who died on that cold April night. On May 1st, 1915, the Lusitania left New York for her week-long crossing to Liverpool, England. Friends waved goodbyes on what they thought would be a routine voyage. But it wasn't. The journey ended in the tragic death of more than 1,000 Americans. Was the sinking of the Lusitania an unprovoked act of war? Why did the unsinkable ship go down so quickly? Public opinion ran high as the blame was laid squarely on Germany. But was the German Navy solely responsible? High society gathered at New York's dockside to bid farewell to the Lusitania. Passengers paid little regard to company leaflets warning them of German U-boats in the Atlantic. Crowds waved goodbye to 1,959 people. Among the passengers was the millionaire Alfred Vanderbilt. The Lusitania was the largest, the fastest, and the most luxurious ship of her time. With a top speed of nearly 26 knots, she had recaptured the blue ribbon from her German rivals. Now, ostensibly to save fuel, one of her 4 turbines had been shut down. It caused a reduction of speed that would put her at a fatal disadvantage if she was forced to outsail a hostile German ship. It did not seem to matter. The United States was neutral. It was unthinkable for the Lusitania to be attacked. Passengers relaxed in the splendor of the lavishly furnished staterooms. The weather on the journey across was splendid. German U-boats had a limited range, and for the first 6 days, no danger threatened. As her route took her round the coast of southern Ireland, however, the Lusitania entered the war zone. Normally, the Royal Navy escorted any ship carrying cargo. Even cargo of mules earlier had warranted 3 destroyers and an armed cruiser. Yet the Lusitania, with its VIP passengers, was sailing the course alone. There had been warnings, and advertisement of the Lusitania's sailing times was accompanied by a notice from the German embassy advising passengers that they traveled at their own risk. German U-boats freely roamed the high seas and scored some spectacular successes. Moreover, a single German U-boat was known to be active in the war zone, which was part of the Lusitania's path. It was commanded by a Captain Schreiger, who had once attacked the hospital ship without warning. During the 30 hours before the Lusitania's arrival, he had sunk 3 vessels off the Irish coast, 2 of them substantial merchant ships. To sink them, he had to use up all but one of his torpedoes. As he awaited the Lusitania, he surfaced to regenerate his batteries, and his crew relaxed in the warm spring sunshine. He had no real hope of sinking the great liner, but equally, he was in no great danger. No armed ships from the British Navy were around to harass him. Off the old head of Kinsale, he again submerged, waiting beneath the calm waters. An hour later, the Lusitania was sighted. The fateful meeting was about to take place. For survivor Mrs. Avis Foley, a 12-year-old girl who had been traveling alone to school in England, disaster struck with unexpected suddenness.
We were enjoying a delicious lunch, which was simply marvelous. The meals were all marvelous on the boat, when suddenly the whole boat was shaken by a tremendous blow. Some people say there were 2 torpedoes, but my recollection is that there was only 1.
I must have been at the wheel almost half an hour, and I heard the lookoutman shout, "There's a torpedo coming on the starboard bow, sir." Well, it no sooner said starboard bow, sir, than that was it. And it must have hit very close behind the bridge, because we couldn't see one another for quite a while, for coal dust and one thing and another, and everybody thought she was going straight over. And the water started to come over the starboard wing of the bridge. The captain said, "Save yourself."
She was listing over to the starboard side pretty steeply, and I was going to get in this boat here, or standing by it, when the fellow got excited, and he was lowering his side down, and the other fellow either couldn't release the ropes, tangled, and I saw all the people emptied into the water. This fellow got panicky and lowered down, and emptied the people into the water. That was the next boat, the one I got in, number 13.
The Lusitania was thought to be unsinkable. She went down, however, with appalling swiftness. 18 minutes in some accounts, 21 minutes in others. For many families, there was not time to find relatives.
I don't know how long I was in the water on the wreckage, but when I came to, there was a crowd around me, and they were pumping water from me. And next thing, they give me a cup of tea and put a blanket round me. When I went along this dock road, they were making mortuaries in each shop with white sheets on and bodies lying on the shop floors. Then from there, I went round thinking I could see my father, and into London Road where I lived. When I got home, it seems my mother was down at Lamb Street with a baby.
The shock of the tragedy was felt on both sides of the Atlantic. 1,201 men, women, and children died. For several days, crowds lingered at the railway station in Liverpool, where survivors were brought, hoping against all odds that a familiar face would be among them. Most were disappointed. In Ireland, mass graves were dug for victims whose bodies had been washed ashore and could not be identified. The inquest accused the Germans of committing willful murder. No awkward questions were asked about why the Lusitania had sunk so quickly, or why only 700 people had been saved. The English newspapers concentrated the blame entirely upon the Germans. Public opinion in Britain and the United States fueled reasons for involvement in World War I. Headlines proclaimed the Germans abandoned their right to be called civilized. Violent mobs demonstrated against the Germans and broke up shops owned by German nationals. Gradually, questions began to appear. Why was the Lusitania left apparently unescorted through dangerous waters? Why did she sink so quickly? After the sinking of the Lusitania, local boats worked non-stop, bringing survivors and bodies to Queenstown, where high street shops were turned into improvised mortuaries. The dockyard has been long deserted by the British Navy. The old courthouse where the coroner condemned the Germans still stands. Close by is a monument to the victims of the German attack. But the greatest reminder of all, the Lusitania, lies south of Queenstown, 315 feet down. After she was sunk, further questions were asked. Why was there no escort? How could such an enormous vessel as the Lusitania be sunk by a single torpedo? Later in the war, a sister ship was struck by no less than 12 torpedoes and still managed to sail to port. For nearly 50 years, the mystery of why the Lusitania sank so quickly lay hidden on the seabed. Then, a team of divers, led by the American John Light, penetrated the murky waters. They brought back photographic evidence of what happened.
In 1960, I first came here to dive on the Lusitania. Between 1960 and 1962, I made 37 dives to her personally. And with the divers that were with me, we made 109 dives altogether.
The divers found the vessel split in half. John Light made a further discovery, which reveals much about the secret cargo aboard the Lusitania.
She does have, however, another split, which is caused by an internal explosion that starts on this side of the ship, just underneath the bridge, and goes down on an angle forward. And as it goes down, it opens out. And the bottom of the ship is pretty well blasted away. Now we can conclude from this that this is an extension of the explosion that occurred by the torpedo hitting the other side of the ship. The bow itself is twisted. It's twisted nearly off. But your plates buckle outwards. And there can be no doubt that an internal explosion is what caused her to sink.
What could have caused such a gigantic explosion? Colin Simpson.
The reason why the Lusitania sunk when she was hit by one torpedo is no longer a mystery. The Lusitania was being used to carry contraband from North America to England. There is no doubt from the ship's manifest that it was a cargo of explosives. She was loaded with shells, with shell fuses, with a type of gun cotton called pyroloxine, and it was all hidden up in the forward holds. Before she was allowed to leave New York, under American neutrality laws, she had to submit a manifest, that's a list of what she was carrying, to the harbour authorities. She submitted a forgery, and the American authorities, full knowing it was a forgery, accepted it. But a truer manifest was also made, and it was locked away. When the torpedo hit, it hit the exact hole, it's called the orlop hole, where the gun cotton was stowed. And the torpedo just made a lot of noise, and the gun cotton blew her bottom out. She sank in 21 minutes.
U.S. knowledge of the explosives on board is revealed by a confidential White House memorandum. President Wilson asked Deputy Secretary Robert Lansing, were any contraband munitions aboard the Lusitania when torpedoed? Lansing replied, practically all her cargo was contraband of some kind. The British Admiralty ordered authorities in Ireland ensure that bodies selected for inquest have not been killed or mutilated by means which we do not wish made public.
So there was a monumental Anglo-American cover-up. It was at the highest level, involving Winston Churchill on the English side and Franklin D. Roosevelt, then Secretary of State for the Navy, on the American side. There's little doubt the American Secretary of State and his deputy both knew the true story. The cover-up had to survive two separate inquiries, one in England and one in New York. Both judges were ordered to suppress certain evidence and keep secret certain papers.
The suppressed documents reveal that Captain William Turner, master of the Lusitania, was to be made the scapegoat. From the British Admiralty came the message, I am directed to inform you that it is considered politically expedient that Captain Turner be most prominently blamed for the disaster. Winston Churchill, First Lord of the Admiralty, agreed. He said, I consider the Admiralty case against the captain should be pressed by a skillful counsel. From Lord Fisher, Captain Turner of the Lusitania is a scoundrel and has been bribed. The master of the Lusitania acted directly contrary to the written general instructions received from Queenstown during the hours immediately preceding the attack. On the facts at present disclosed, the master appears to have displayed an almost inconceivable negligence, and one is forced to conclude that he is either utterly incompetent or has been got at by the Germans. Sir Edward Grey, Foreign Secretary, underlined the official approach. He said, Captain Turner was fully informed of the presence of hostile submarines in the vicinity of the place in which he was torpedoed. The inquiry was told the captain recklessly took the unarmed Lusitania into a danger area.
Lusitania was deliberately sent into a hazardous area where there was a German U-boat without escorts and with a dangerous cargo. And the tragedy could have been avoided. The Lusitania was designed as an armed cruiser. The archives of the National Maritime Museum clearly hold the drawings showing that she was designed to carry 12 6-inch guns. The guns were actually fitted on May the 13th, 1913. Churchill had the thought of the Lusitania being attacked by the Germans very much on his mind. He commissioned a paper on the political repercussions in the event of the Lusitania being sunk by a German submarine, 5 weeks before this happened. That morning, as the Lusitania approached the old head of Kinsale, the King of England had seen the American ambassador, had said to him, what will happen if the Lusitania is sunk? Now, the Admiralty says she was clearly warned and she was told to steer a certain course. But in the Admiralty records, the page of that signal log is missing. Off the south coast of Southern Ireland is a little signal station called Valencia, which monitored those signals. And the pages of that signal book are still there. They clearly show that the Lusitania was not told that the U-20 was waiting for her. And worst of all, the only sensible message clearly identified her to anybody listening. That reads, to Alfred Vanderbilt aboard the SS Lusitania Valencia, hope you have a safe crossing. Looking forward to seeing you soon. At the last minute, and without telling anyone on board the Lusitania, all those escorts were withdrawn. Either it was monumental mismanagement or a calculated risk. And I've come to the conclusion it's a calculated risk.
Buried in Queenstown, far from home, the victims may therefore have been casualties of international diplomacy. Churchill, it is known, wished above all to bring the United States into the war. He wrote later, "In spite of all its horror, we must regard the sinking of the Lusitania as an event most important and favorable to the Allies." At the summit, true politics and strategy are one. The maneuver which brings an ally into the field is as serviceable as that which wins a great battle. Those who died in the Lusitania were perhaps victims not just of war, but of politics. Echoes of the Lusitania began in 1941 with the USS Greer. An American destroyer, the Greer was on a mail run to Iceland. A British patrol plane spotted a German submarine and alerted the USS Greer. The Greer began to aggressively track the U-boat. The Germans, wishing to avoid detection, submerged. For 2 hours, the Greer and the German U-boat played a game of cat and mouse. Because the Greer was unmarked, the Germans assumed they were being pursued by a British destroyer, and the U-boat fired a torpedo at the American ship. The USS Greer set off depth charges.
In spite of what Hitler's propaganda bureau has invented, in spite of what any American obstructionist organization may prefer to believe, I tell you the blunt fact that the German submarine fired first upon this American destroyer, Greer, without warning and with deliberate design to sink her.
Just as the sinking of the Lusitania speeded America's entrance into World War I, the Greer incident provided the same two leaders, Roosevelt and Churchill, with reasons for stepping up America's hostilities toward Germany prior to World War II.